Welcome into another episode of the Play-by-Play, a sports media talk show from Awful Announcing, where, like Stephen A. Smith, the world is officially our oyster. I am Brandon Kleen, a staff writer at Awful Announcing. That is Ben Axelrod, a senior editor at Awful Announcing. Later on, our guy Drew Lerner is coming by to discuss his experience covering TGL in Florida in person. But first, our instant replay today, Stephen A. Smith makes history. Our guy Brandon Contes from Awful Announcing is here. He is the host of our flagship Awful Announcing podcast and our, I think, preeminent Stephen A. Smith scholar, which is really the reason that I think we had to have him on, Ben. But I'll just give the details. We've talked about this since I think it was November, maybe even when these details first emerged. 5 years, upwards of $100 million to remain at ESPN. His contract was set to expire this summer. He is cutting back on his, kind of recurring cast member role on NBA Countdown, part of the studio coverage for the NBA and the finals and everything else on ESPN. Yes, inside the NBA, obviously coming in to replace that. He could make more appearances around NFL coverage, Monday Night Football, Monday Night Countdown. We'll see. The bottom line of this, everywhere you look, is that Stephen A. is working less for more money, and wouldn't all of us love to be doing that? Ben, I'll start with you. Stephen A. kind of feels like he just got a massive W in this negotiation with ESPN. It's even more Stephen A. beneficial than the first time we talked about the initial rumors, I feel like. Are you surprised by how this all came together?
Yeah, I was just trying to run down what he would have left on the table. Like, what did he not get out of this that he would have wanted? And I maybe leasing the Stephen A. Smith show to ESPN, like Pat McAfee. Like, that's the only thing I could come up with as far as what he didn't get. I mean,
if he even wanted that, right?
Right. And that's, we could definitely debate whether that would even be something he would want to do, or if it's better for him to have that as his own entity and fallback project in case something happens down the line. But I think that, he's the highest paid talent at ESPN now, which was, I think, goal number one. It's less work. It's the freedom to seemingly do whatever he wants. And I think 6 months ago, we could have had a debate about who's the most powerful person at ESPN, who's the biggest talent, who's their headliner. It's Stephen A. Smith now. This cements it for me.
Brandon, what surprised you most when you saw everything come out last week?
Well, first of all, thanks for having me on. I thought about canceling 5 minutes ago just so you guys could see get a feel for what I deal with booking guests on the Awful Announcing podcast. But I don't think I wasn't really surprised, because these are the numbers that we were talking about the entire time. And I felt all along like they were going to cement Stephen A. as the face of the network. And Brendon, I thought that your piece on the site about sports media being in its mascot era, I thought that was great. And I couldn't agree more about the thought, ESPN is basically paying to stay attached to Stephen A. Smith at this point. And I think they can trust that he could go out and make headlines away from their network on cable news and on The View and on his own podcast. And those headlines, they can be political. They could be about race. They could be about transgender athletes, Donald Trump, Democrats, Republicans. They could be controversial and polarizing, but ESPN right now trusts that he's not going to put them in a bad spot. And I think part of that is because they treated the last 2 years almost like a test run. Give Stephen A. the freedom to say what he wants, where he wants. If it works, great, he's our guy. If not, we can move on. And it worked. It's been good publicity for Stephen A. and for ESPN. So much so that now it is morphing into that conversation of the belief, can he actually run for president at some point? But he is the face of ESPN. And if it's not Stephen A. Smith, then who were they going to turn to? If they lost Stephen A., was it going to be Mike Greenberg? Could they convince Shannon Sharp to buy in full time? Was it going to be Pat McAfee? And whereas Stephen A can go out and make these headlines and they're controversial, but they never put the network in a bad spot. Like, it seems like Pat tends to get himself in more trouble than Stephen A when he ventures away from sports. And the other thing is, like, I'm sure ESPN is confident that Stephen A is going to be here years from now, whereas they have to constantly be on edge and wondering, like, is Pat going to just pack up and leave? Is he going to take his ball and go home because he doesn't like the way he's treated?
Yeah, one of the things that I feel like maybe gets not enough, that Stephen A doesn't get enough respect for when you look at the dynamic of these negotiations or just his career or whatever angle you're looking at it from, is that he's a company man proudly. Yeah. Like, he loves to talk about the number one thing you got to do when you're in his position is make your boss's money. If you listen to any interview with him, he says that all the time. And so it doesn't exactly surprise me. I mean, it doesn't surprise me at all that he would be back at ESPN. But it also, like, it doesn't surprise me that we got here either, because if you think, like you mentioned Shannon Sharpe, Brandon, it was like, I mean, around the time I started at Awful Announcing, was covering this stuff day to day, a year and a half ago or whatever. That was in the middle of Shannon leaving FS1, Stephen A's openly teasing that Shannon could be his replacement on First Take, which was doubly news because the Shannon element, but also the why do you need a replacement on First Take element of that kind of news cycle. Like, are you leaving? What's going on? And I think it's a great way to put it that he has used, I think what mattered to him is that he could get this freedom. He had his sights on expanding his empire, expanding his platform, being known for more than just sports from all the way back then, if not longer ago. And I would say, frankly, his whole career, if you look back at some of the things that he's gotten in trouble for or stepped on toes with, it's always been this same stuff. But I think he knew that the only way to get it and stay at ESPN was to go this path, which is to kind of step more and more, toe, foot, leg, knee, whatever, into the water over time. And now here he is, and he's earned it. And he doesn't have to go on his own and, do what a lot of media people across all of media are doing these days, which is start a, Substack and a YouTube and all. He gets a $20 million salary and this. And so obviously, like we said, it's a huge win-win. But the fact that he did this kind of the old-fashioned way is crazy, but not surprising. And that's kind of where we are, is that ESPN with this contract is like, with a smile on their face, signing up for the opportunity to make him the face of their network without any question. It's not like he has them, they're an equal culprit in this, and I think the mascot concept is why they're in his Instagram bio. They're on the Chiron when he goes out to the View. They're getting plugged on his podcast just as much as vice versa. So it's a very different type of arrangement than we're used to, but it's very clearly where we are. Any other thoughts, Ben, before I want to ask you guys about what he wants with this freedom, but I don't want to wrap the contract talk if we're still there.
I was just going to say, I think it's interesting that it worked out this way, that he's still an ESPN employee, because if we were doing this show a year ago, my prediction would have been he's going to go do his own thing and lease content to ESPN. Like, it seemed like ESPN was kind of in a rent don't buy period. And I wonder if maybe the Pat McAfee experience has given them pause to that. But I do think there's a part of ESPN that likes that, like, Pat can go out and Pat can create controversy, and it doesn't necessarily reflect on ESPN. Like, even I know the way I cover Pat, I try not to like position him as an ESPN employee because he's not an ESPN employee. But the fact that it did work out this way, and I think that's an important distinction, is not only did he stay at ESPN, but to Brandon's point, he is a proud company man. Like he likes waving that flag. He likes that banner. So I just think, like, the evolution of this, however it took form, going on 2 years now, the fact that it played out this way, I find really interesting.
Brandon, do you think there's something he gets, Stephen A., out of being associated with ESPN besides just the platform and the money? Like, why does he want to continue to sign up for this? Because there was, I forgot that part of the whole saga. There was the I might leave part. Then there was the I'm going to sell my show back to the company I used to work for part, and none of that happened. So he chose to stay here just as much as obviously he's getting the raise and everything.
Yeah, I think and for sure, like there were a lot of times that he spoke so highly of Pat McAfee, being owning his own content, and it seemed like Stephen A was going to try to potentially move in that direction. I do think there's absolutely a cross promotion aspect to it, like being involved with ESPN, especially if he is going to start getting to appear on Monday Night Football, Monday Night Countdown, and stuff like that. Like that is huge. And if he is trying to grow his own brand, like to whatever he has his sight set on at this point, like being part of ESPN certainly helps that. And I think he does look at his own podcast as and views that as still an opportunity to sell that content elsewhere, whether it is eventually back to ESPN. Like just because he signed this contract doesn't mean that he can't potentially still do that in the future with his podcast. So I think he's still looking at that as like a bit of a second lottery ticket,
especially with Flagship coming up later this year.
Yeah, I think we're very clearly going to be even more in an era where that type of agreement is more commonplace, even than it feels like we're in right now with McAfee or a couple. That's just going to be the main, I think, kind of programming deal in a few years' time. And so I think it's a good call that this doesn't end that possibility. But so Stephen A has said that the delay here between a few months when we kind of first talked about all this and now was that negotiation over the freedom to go off platform. Any of us, obviously, like we cover this stuff. We've interviewed ESPN talent before. We know how much of a minefield it can be, as Brandon teased at the beginning, to get these people, especially if it's not even just like a phone interview, but anytime they're doing an on-air thing, like there's so many hoops. I would imagine Stephen A has fewer of them, but very clearly was still having to check and run these things by. Now he doesn't have to, from what it sounds like. I think part of why the president, the campaign, the political candidacy, whatever stuff took hold, not just because it's fun to talk about and he's good at milking it, but also was because this whole saga, it felt like he was very clearly, he wants more. He wants less guardrails. He wants more opportunities. He wants a bigger platform. And I looked at that and I sort of said, like, well, he already has his own show where he's interviewing political candidates of his own on his own. He's paid as well as anyone in media. Forget sports, Rachel Maddow or anybody you throw up there. He's already has the money. So I like part of why I bit on the president stuff was that it felt like an obvious answer to the question of what does Stephen A. Smith want? And so, Brandon, I think this is where maybe, the more debate side of this conversation might come in, because I know you feel differently, at least that it's going to happen soon. So explain why you don't think it's going to happen soon, but also what is going to happen in the meantime if 2028's not actually going to be the year of, Stephen A. Smith on the debate stage.
Well, so like, I think that he could be chasing becoming a billionaire. Like, I think that's in his mind. I think he believes like he could eventually become a billionaire. I think he believes he could have his own brand and just become super famous as compared to being very famous like he is right now. And I don't think that he would run in 2028, nor do I really think that he believes he could win. And maybe farther down the road. But I don't think that he's famous enough to overcome his admitted shortcomings when it comes to political knowledge, at least not yet. And like lifelong politicians, they still offer a semblance of comfort in a party. I think other politicians feel comfortable supporting them. A lot of voters still do feel comfortable supporting them. Maybe those voters aren't like ready for the drastic change that is Stephen A. Smith yet. And most importantly, donors feel comfortable supporting them. So like you need to be mega famous to overcome that comfort level and to prove that you're worth investing in to try something different. And Stephen A. Smith is really, really famous. Like, I'm sure he gets recognized everywhere he goes. But Trump was a global brand for decades before he ran for president, and before he became president. And like then the Apprentice started to make him a little bit more popular with the general public. Like Stephen A. only started to transcend sports a few years ago. It wasn't even that long ago that he couldn't beat Joe Beningo and Evan Roberts in a New York sports radio ratings battle. It's like I'm not ready to say he's as famous as Donald Trump has been at any point in the last 40 years.
I like that framing. And I even just after we were kind of messaging about it, I was coming around to this idea that there's maybe a longer game, if nothing else. I still do think he could consider it eventually, but the comparison to Donald Trump, I think, is a good one. I mean, for obvious reasons, but in the way you were putting it, because I think Stephen A's been famous for a long time, but I guess I would put it that, and I don't mean this as a knock on him, I mean it in like the, he's been respected for a lot less time than Trump. Trump's been wealthy and elite for his whole life. Stephen A probably, I mean, he was a joke for a while, I think, to a lot of people, whether he was famous or not, and only the past maybe since he kind of took first takeover maybe and began to broaden, has he become, I think, respected and move in the same types of circles that we know politics kind of always grow out from, those types of circles. So that feels right to me, and I guess it's a little bit of an answer to what does he want, and the billionaire idea, I think, goes into that of he wants to get to those circles and then maybe decide where to go from there, right, Ben? What do you think?
Yeah, and I think, what he's been doing lately in the last 4 or 5 months now since Trump got reelected has been very interesting. The way he's not only positioned himself as a political figure, but tried to appeal to both sides of the aisle. I mean, he had Candace Owens like on his show last week. Like I think that's a little, spicier of a guest than he's maybe had. I think that's a little different than just going on Hannity and bullshitting about the topic of the day for 20 minutes at a time. But
it's outside establishment traditional media.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the point about he's only been respected for a short period of time, I think that's a good one, because I do think if Stephen A were to ever run for president, I think the arc for him is obvious. I was in media, I got laid off, and then I made something of myself. Like I came back, I got laid off, and anybody who follows Stephen A knows that him getting laid off from ESPN, that was like the turning point in his life. Like that is where he aspired to global domination in whatever he's doing now. So I think that's something that, could be an interesting arc and could be an interesting story that he could tell voters, especially if he's trying to appeal to a certain demographic of voters. But yeah, I mean, I think I'm along with Brandon. I think 2028's off the table right now, but I do think, like, I'm not ruling it out as early as 2032.
So, Brandon, you another interesting point on that, though, that I want to keep on is you said you think he doesn't believe he could win, and I know he's kind of been he's acknowledged his limitations, and that I will say for me is what drives me crazy about his political content. Is it feels like the best comp I would have is like a Mad Lib. He's grasping at things he knows are talking points, but he doesn't ever explain them or tell you that he actually believes them. He says the Democrats have problems with blank because that is like a general headline that he know, but it's not what he thinks the Democrats struggled with. It's like what the idea is that you know what I mean? It just kind of grates on me after a while. And so I think he's been open that limitation exists, but he also has said, I think I could beat all of them. And it's classic Stephen A trolling, but I guess it's also like you seem to think he doesn't actually believe what he's saying.
Yeah, and I don't think so. Whereas I said that that fame was part of the issue. I don't think Stephen A thinks fame is the issue at all. Like I believe
yeah.
he thinks that he is famous enough. So that's where I would certainly differ with him on that. But I don't think he really believes he could win an election. I'm not sure that he truly believes that he could jump in and win a debate right now. And I think you made a great point with like his just his political takes and arguments. Like there's no substance to anything that he says politically. Stephen A talking politics is basically the same as somebody just saying Lamar Jackson can't win a Super Bowl, and then you offer no additional context. Like
it's frankly not that surprising if you watch First Take.
Right. Yeah, it is similar. Like that's how he can, his debates are more performance based than they are actually like based on any sort of real substance or intelligence. And like that's kind of the way he's approached politics at this stage in his like political talking career. Everything is on a macro level. Like even when he's on cable news shows, when he's talking to Hannity, like he's not going in depth on any issues. And I think some of that resonates with the viewer because everybody can kind of understand what he's saying and relate to it. But I don't think it will resonate nearly as much when he is asked a question of substance and he's with next to a politician. Like he has all these political figures on his podcast. Ben, you mentioned Candace Owens last week that he had, and he had said after having her on, he said something like, "Don't even think about challenging her intelligence." And like, say what you want about Candace Owens, question her authenticity. Candace Owens found a lane and like was smart enough to figure out a way to capitalize on it. So like credit her for that. But challenging her intelligence, like that's exactly what somebody like Stephen A. Smith should be trying to do if he has her on his podcast.
True.
So
yeah,
so that's what you're going to have to do in a political debate. So if he can't do it with Candace Owens on his own show, how are we supposed to believe that he would actually be able to do it on the debate stage?
Go ahead, Ben.
Yeah, I was just going to say too, like, again, kind of along those lines, like say what you will about Donald Trump. Like he had his signature issues. Like he had the birther stuff that he, kind of built his entire political platform on. Like we don't know what Stephen A. Smith stands for.
And Trump knew how to rally a base.
Exactly. And that's like, we just don't like, I don't even know like what Stephen A. Smith is standing for right now, other than like, I'm not a traditional Democrat. Like I haven't seen any Republican views. I haven't seen any Democratic views. It's more just like, hey, I'm a sports guy, but I'm also allowed to talk about politics.
Well, some of this is what I think when we had Jay Caspian Kang on last week that I think he wasn't, and in his article wasn't giving enough credence to, which is that he said that the platform is truth-telling and no bullshit and everything else. And I think that takes you, I think, roughly to where Stephen A. is right now, right?
Yeah.
But I don't think it can take you all the way to where he is teasing wanting to get to. Because in addition to Trump's, like, rhetorical abilities, he also could play a convincing business magnate, because in theory he is. And to Brandon's point earlier, like he had done business all over the world. He could at least name drop some Saudi dude we've never heard of and perform a level of like savvy and knowledge and understanding of the world that at least allowed him to get up to a point. But I think that the place I kind of want to end this, I think, is where we're already getting, which I sort of mapped it out this way. The first 5 years after Stephen A. made it back to ESPN were about kind of transforming the network around the first takeifying the network, right? Like he sort of made his stamp on that show and then that whole network. The next 5 years, I think you could say, we're becoming the face of the network. He does his ESPN radio show again. He's kind of everywhere. He's the executive producer of First Take. He kills off Max Kellerman, obviously, figure of speech. He does all that. And then the next 5 years, I think, are going to be about rising above the network. And so I wanted to ask you guys what you think that's going to look like in more practical terms. And I think the person, not Donald Trump, who I come back to as we imagine this is Joe Rogan. Like he wants to be.
You stole my point. That was my
Yeah,
point.
yeah. And I think it works. So I'll let you expand on it because I'll end there. Is just like that thinness of perspective, I think, gets thrown at Rogan, even among his supporters, even among people who watch the show, is like, that's what's frustrating about people where impact and content are the point. And I'm curious to see if Stephen A can, if he's interested in, and if he can get past that. And if not, how far, what can he do just being another Joe Rogan? I don't even mean the Joe Rogan to the left BS that got through, but just another person like that. I don't know if that is where this will stop or if he actually can take it further. Because Joe Rogan could not run for president any year.
No.
I think we all know that, but maybe Stephen A cares enough to get a little deeper. I don't know.
Yeah, and that's like, I think you think about Joe Rogan, and Joe Rogan just means a different thing to almost everybody. Like, to some people, he's the guy who platforms conspiracy theorists. To some people, he's the UFC guy. To some people, he's like the guy who runs the comedy, the theater with Kill Tony and Shane Gillis and the Austin Empire down there. So like, I just think like that's kind of what Stephen A. Smith is aspiring to. Is he doesn't want to be labeled as the guy who bullshits with Dan Orlovsky about Josh Allen 5 days a week. Like he wants to have his hands in all sorts of different things. I think that's where the Monday Night Football aspect of this comes in, because like that would be his version of UFC for Joe Rogan, even though it'd be kind of different roles. So I just think you also look at like, I'm not married to the left, I'm not married to the right, I'm my own man. Like that whole kind of approach, that's very Joe Rogan like. So I just think there's a lot of obvious parallels there. And I think that's Joe Rogan's bigger than Stephen A. Smith, right?
Oh yeah.
Yes,
Definitely.
Yeah. So that's I think.
So first take was is Stephen A.'s Fear Factor.
Yeah. And I think
is that where we're at?
I think that makes, quite frankly, the Man Show reboot. So we're somewhere in there. But yeah, I just think that's a natural comparison, obviously, since we both arrived at it independently. But I do think, just real quick, I think that we're talking about how he's not famous enough. And I agree. Like, I think we're all kind of on the same page there. The fact that he is like in these polls, and even if he's only polling at 2%, is like pretty remarkable. Like, I think that shows he's on a trajectory where if he wants to reach that Joe Rogan level, like it's there for him.
Well, and Brandon, I'll let you get the last word here, but I think that's the point that that's the point of his during this whole political tease saga that I take the most seriously, and maybe it's just because I agree with it, is he thinks the same thing you just said, Ben, which is like, how pathetic is it that I'm showing up on these polls? What does it say about our country and the party that I'm theoretically aligned with that I'm on these lists? I should be nowhere near these lists, you know? And I think it kind of does add up to the can't be contained, contrarian kind of lane that he's trying to occupy that obviously is reminiscent of Rogan. But Brandon, last words, what are your thoughts here on the future of Stephen A?
Yeah, and I don't remember if he was ever in the pollings, but I do remember that you were able to even bet on Dave Portnoy becoming president in 2021 after the 2020 election. So like, yes, like it is crazy that he's polling in the single digits and like to see him on all these lists, but I still think that he's not polling nearly high enough to really take him seriously. And I think, well, one thing I'll say is I do think that there is a quicker path to him becoming what Joe Rogan is than there is a path to him becoming president. And I think part of that is going back to Trump again. Like, do you remember when Trump first started running for president? Like his first campaign attempt was in 1988. So like Trump had campaign attempts in 88, in 2000, in 2012, and then he finally actually ran in 2016. And maybe Stephen A. doesn't have to wait that long and tease a run that many times, but I do think that he needs everybody to kind of spend time being disappointed that he's not running, to build excitement and have them start really clamoring for him to actually run. And I think it'll take a couple of cycles of teasing a run and acting like he's capable of upending the political system and the Democratic Party to really build traction. So like polling in the single digits is not enough. A year of weekly cable news appearances is not enough. Stephen A. Smith almost needs to tantalize the public with this, like tease a run and get them disappointed that he's not running. And he has to do that for years before he actually like really goes all in on anything.
Real quick, Brandon, while you're still here, I wanted to get your thoughts on his podcast with Skip Bayless.
I thought that was really disappointing.
Really?
I listened to that whole thing and like felt like I was digging to get stuff. And I think part of that is just like Skip Bayless's podcast as a whole has been really disappointing. Like he teased having this show that was going to be an opportunity for him to say everything that he's always wanted to say, and it's like it's nothing. Like it's tamer than stick. It's even tamer than when he was on television. So like he's got this podcast platform and he's doing nothing with it, and he has Stephen A on, and like they're just kind of like casually talking about sports. Like I didn't even expect any heated debates, but like at least talk about something that we haven't heard before. And like for the most part, everything was just recycled topics and recycled conversations and stuff that we always knew. For this to be like their big reunion show for the first time after 9 years apart, I thought it was a bust.
Well, at least Ernestine got the day off.
Yeah.
When I opened it up and saw the chapter titles on YouTube, and they were Tim Tebow, Cowboys, LeBron, I was like, okay.
Play the hits,
X
baby.
on the tab.
Yeah.
Play the hits from 20 years ago. That's what everyone wanted to see.
2011.
All right. Thank you, Brandon. Everybody check out the Awful Announcing podcast. Brandon does a great job interviewing all of the newsmakers when their bosses don't cancel on him across sports media. Seth Davis this week, yes?
Seth Davis this week, yes. That'll be out Friday morning.
All right. Next up, Drew Lerner will dive into the world of tomorrow and golf with TGL. All right. Back here with Drew Lerner. Just basically, I mean, might as well be like a parentheses co-host of the show at this point. He keeps dropping by, but we are here to talk about. Do we say tomorrow's golf league? Does anybody even do that? Is it just TGL? I mean, it's the new gamified, digitized South Florida golf league spurred by Rory McIlroy and Tiger Woods. Drew was there. We'll go through some of the. I'll just go through some of the numbers here before I pass it over to you, Drew, to kind of talk through what you saw in person. So averaging around 500,000 viewers overall per broadcast. That, quote, exceeded ESPN's pre-launch expectations, according to Sportico. Very good number if you look at a lot of other new leagues especially, but even, frankly, a lot of just leagues, period. Median age of audience was competitive with the NBA and like 12 years younger than most PGA golf events. So that is obviously a huge arrow in their quiver. That is something golf has desperately needed for a long time. The one thing I could not find, I feel like I've re-Googled this a dozen times as we've tried to talk about it on the show or I've covered it. There are no details on the broadcast deal with ESPN. No dollar figure, no anything that I can find. So maybe you know more than me, Drew, but let us know if so, and then take us through kind of what you saw and heard as you were able to venture out there and check it out for yourself.
Yeah, so to answer that question quickly, CNBC's Alex Sherman actually had a report on this earlier this week. It's the first time I'd seen any number. Said less than $10 million per year from ESPN. So it's very insignificant, the media rights deal, which is important context, right? Like, this is a very expensive startup. They built an entire stadium. I mean, not even 14 months ago, that stadium collapsed and they had to rebuild it. So there's been a lot of investment in TGL from the get-go. And, you know, less than $10 million in rights fees isn't really going to keep the lights on there. But you just laid out a lot of the data that I would like to touch on as well. It's like, this has been a successful first season for them. Over 500,000 viewers. I believe that's approximately 20% of a bigger audience, larger viewership than the comparable windows last year. So that was mostly college basketball, some NHL, some studio programming when they're on ESPN2. That's a pretty impressive number. Like, that's kind of the benchmark that you're going for as a new league. Like, am I better than the replacement level programming that we're taking over? And TGL was very successful at that. And like you mentioned, the young audience, competing with the NBA, which is kind of the belle of the ball when it comes to demographics. That's incredibly impressive for a sport that is essentially golf, right? Like, golf is not a sport that generally attracts younger television audiences. So it's hard to argue that TGL hasn't had a successful first year.
What would you attribute that to? Why it is so attractive to younger audiences? Is it the technology aspect of it? Is it the names involved? Like, why would this league, upstart league without any history, why would this be what's attracting a younger audience?
Yeah, it's an interesting question. I mean, I think when you talk to people involved in TGL, they say it's because it looks like a video game, right? This is very familiar to a younger audience. And, funnily enough, about 2 years ago now, I did a similar story on my old publication over at Live Golf. And it's the same exact thing that they told me. We're trying to make the broadcast look like a video game. But it's very clear that TGL has actually been able to capitalize on that and get that younger audience. Whereas Live, I believe, their median age is somewhere up in the 60s. I think it's close to 62. TGL's is a full decade younger than that. So, when we're talking about golf's two kind of renegade leagues here, it's clear who the winner is when it comes to attracting that younger demo.
I think the other aspect of it, just from what I've seen, because I mean, we should lay out just overall what the experience of watching this and kind of how it works, right? They drive off of a tee in the arena. It's similar to a lot of golf simulators people have played in, whatever arcade or whatever. It's the highest possible tech version of that. And then they putt on a green in live, right? So it's kind of a combination of both. And I think that what I like about it, what I could see people who might not love golf liking about it, is elements that it borrows from, I would say, another golf experiment, which, like, the match, right? The hangout, the vibe, the atmosphere, the looseness of it. I think, honestly, the golfers being game to play along and not be so buttoned up has been a huge part of it. But I would say another element of it is, you mentioned investment from, fundraisers and whatnot. It's also been a bigger commitment from ESPN than I would have ever expected. I think the talent that they've put onto this helps that atmosphere along in a big way, whether that's Scott Van Pelt obviously being more of that sense of authority and doing interviews and whatnot, but Matt Berry at the desk, and then especially Marty Smith, I think has knocked it out of the park, or knocked it into the screen and through a video game, fairway, I guess might be the better metaphor for this. But that, I think, is part of what's fun. It's passive viewing for sure. It's something to kind of just have on, but it's fun and loose and interesting enough that it is maybe better than other passive viewing options. It feels kind of reductive because these are people actually playing a game, but I think that I was surprised, Drew, that everybody that you talked to seemed to basically say that. They're not shy about the fact that that's what they're going for, and I do think that they've really succeeded in creating that, and I think that's a big part of why young people would want to watch it.
Yeah, and I want to touch on your first point there as well, how you said you compared it to the match, right, which has been a long-running series on TNT. That's a little bit of a scary comparison when I look at TGL. Because if you've looked at the recent editions of the match, despite still getting really A-list talent to go out there and play golf, the viewership has not been good. It has declined a fair bit since that first one between Tiger and Phil. So I actually asked that specific question while I was there. I said, how do you make this about the golf, right? Because it's not a proven it's not proven to be successful when you rely on professional golfers' personalities to be driving the television show, right? These guys are not the most entertaining people. A lot of them are very stoic. Like, that's how you become good at golf. So while there are some personalities on TGL, building an entire franchise around golfers' personalities probably isn't the most sustainable. So I think the next step for TGL is really like, how do you get people to care about who's winning and who's losing, what teams are winning, like who's going to, win the championship at the end of the season. And that's going to be a much heavier lift than, this first season where it's still been a bit of a novelty.
It feels like a cross between like esports being the kind of thing that, the video game stuff makes you think of, but also it had me thinking about, and maybe this is because I've been reading, as Ben and I had talked about last week, the ESPN oral history, and there's a whole section in there about the World Series of Poker and how much of a shocking success that was. It kind of feels like it's somewhere in that neighborhood too, where it's like, again, but I don't care. I wouldn't personally care about who was going to win the poker game that happened to be featured on camera for the 10 minutes I swung through watching that in 2006 or whatever. So I do think that's a big issue. I also think the obvious other issue is the same one that golf has, which is, what do you do when Tiger's not involved, right? And what happens if you're talking about personalities and results and actually wanting this to feel like a league and not just something people happen to have on their TVs. It's kind of like the Caitlin Clark thing with WNBA ratings last year, where it's like, okay, that's what it was total, but what if you strip away Caitlin? What does it look like? It's that kind of same dynamic with Tiger this year, where he's drawing 1 million plus, but the weeks where the broadcasts where his team's not playing, things obviously dip as they have for years now, as Tiger's career is kind of faded. So what do you think, Ben? How would you try to develop that with this, from what you've watched, and trying to get it to matter a little more to people?
I think, and I'm not, the most golf savvy person. I do think one interesting aspect that's just caught me as a casual viewer has been the team aspect of it. And I don't know how sustainable that is. Like, if you're going to have people growing up being diehard fans of TGL teams, but it was kind of jarring. Like, I got an email, from the hat brand 47 promoting TGL hats. I'm like, what's this cool LA hat? Like, what's this? And I click on it, and it's like all these TGL, all this gear, all this merch. And like, I'm not accustomed to that being a part of my golf viewing experience as a fan. So I don't know. I don't know if that has staying power, but I could see that being at least one avenue to generating brand loyalty, especially if the hats are cool.
Yeah. And, the reason for something like that happening, TGL has so many like insanely powerful businessmen like involved, like that are owning teams that have invested in tomorrow's sport. You have, the Fenway Sports Group, you have Steve Cohen, the owner of the Mets, the former 76ers owner. Like, there's a lot of people that, have a lot of experience running professional sports franchises that are obviously involved with companies like 47 Hats and whatnot, that are able to, push this product out there and have the networks to really, kind of expand on TGL's first season. That's, I think, when I look at the bull case for TGL, that's a big part of the reason why I think this could be a successful venture.
So the team and like the team loyalty, team affinity, fandom aspect of it reminds me of a problem that I think one thing that connects TGL to Unrivaled, which has kind of been this randomly like sister news story to TGL, because it's another upstart league, also weirdly both in South Florida, and they, I think, have the same problem where I've checked out Unrivaled a little bit because I just, have covered women's sports a lot, care about the WNBA stuff, and that's obviously just a growing sport that I'm curious about. And I don't know who the hell's on any team over there. I have to look it up every time. They tell me who's about to be playing. That gives me no info, whatever. But I think another thing that aside from the geographical and that comparison that ties these two together is, it's kind of been this business story from the standpoint of we talk about it with like, my Phoenix Suns team, the Stars and Scrubs kind of roster building model. I almost think of it the same way with ESPN right now, where they're paying exorbitant amounts for football, basketball, college football. They just parted ways with Formula One and MLB, and we'll see where that goes. And they're, I think, experimenting with the idea of, can things like this be innings eaters, be, bench players for them to just survive in the slots where baseball and other things might have been in a past era where things were, costs were more spread out and there was more costs that they could even allot. So I guess my question for you, Drew, is like, where do TGL ratings have to kind of steady out for that to feel viable to you? Or does it flip and maybe ESPN eventually could move off of it and it just becomes actually a good investment for a smaller network that doesn't need such a high threshold? What do you kind of think happens there?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think when you think about ESPN dropping Major League Baseball, this is another thing I actually asked while I was down there. I said, what does like a summer league look like? Like, would you guys want to expand into some of those windows that are freshly available? And that's just a huge challenge for the overall golf schedule, because the summertime is kind of the heart of major season, and getting guys to agree to want to play on Mondays and Tuesday nights when they could be, heading to Augusta National or any other major venue would be challenging. So I wouldn't necessarily expect TGL to expand into that part of the calendar. But I do see your point where, like, if TGL can find like a baseline audience, which I believe, they probably have this season, it'll be much more interesting to see, what the numbers look like next season. But there's clearly an audience there, right? Like, it's very digestible 2-hour windows. It's on nights of the week that there's really nothing else going on aside from, college basketball. So it just gives people another option. And I think that's really been the value proposition for the league thus far. It's like, it's just not competing with anything.
That's I think their timing on the calendar, just again from my own personal anecdotal experience, that's what stood out. Just talking to my friends, it's like, all right, Tuesday night's TGL night. Like, this has replaced Maction on the calendar for our viewing habits in the fall. And so the fact that they have picked this time in the calendar where it can kind of stand out separate from football season, you're not, in the heart of golf's diehard season. Basketball still kind of mulling to the finish line in its playoffs. I think that's in terms of what's working. It seems like they picked like the perfect spot on the calendar for this.
My last question, this is more golf related, and it's just out of curiosity because I wanted to circle back to Tiger. He's obviously been one of the main people pushing this forward. It clearly matters to him. Obviously, there's the PGA versus Live dynamic and the sorting of stars and all that nonsense that's kind of been going on for a while. But just as more of a golf fan than me, like, does it seem like the idea with something like this is that a player like Tiger could participate for a lot longer, like than he could? I mean, obviously, I know the answer is yes, but does it seem like he could be around for 10 years doing this, or what do you think?
Well, that's definitely part of it. I mean, he's probably going to get a lot more viewers playing TGL than he would on any sort of senior tour out there. So this does keep Tiger in the spotlight. And the other thing about it is when Tiger's involved, and of course he's heavily involved as a co-founder of Tomorrow Sports, recruiting people to play in this becomes a lot easier, right? Like, you can get the biggest names in the PGA Tour because these guys idolize Tiger Woods. Like, you do not say no to Tiger Woods if you're, Xander Schauffele or Tom Kim. Like, you grew up watching him. You're probably a huge fan. It doesn't really matter how much you're getting paid or what the time commitment is. When Tiger asks you to play in TGL, you play. Like, that's kind of the short of it.
Awesome. Well, I do agree. It's been fun to watch. It is better than a lot of things that I could be watching on sports TV most nights. I've found myself having it on after, my awful announcing shift or anything else and getting much more into it than I ever would have expected, which is part of why we wanted to have you on, Drew, to actually break it down. And then once we found out you were going, it was even more perfect. But yeah, definitely a story to continue to monitor going into year 2. And a lot of these kind of upstart leagues that are filling those innings for major networks, I think, are an even bigger picture story. But all right. Thank you to Drew. Thank you to Brandon. Ben and I will wrap with our hot mics right after this. All right, closing out the show with our hot mics of the week, something that caught Ben and I's attention. We liked, we disliked, maybe we just want to shout out. I will kick us off here, Ben. So the official announcement around, picked the wrong word there, around the horn ending came out last week. The end date will be May 23rd. We have already talked about the looming cancellation and all the reasons for it and everything else. But the conversation naturally moved to what will or should replace it. I think Michael McCarthy at Front Office Sports said some kind of insiders show would be cool. I don't geek out about insiders as much as he seems to, but that could happen, I suppose. I think it should be a college football show. Doesn't that sound like the obvious thing to finally try to put a Band-Aid on the complaints that college football fans have had about ESPN for so long, which is that they hardly make an effort to cover the show on the main mothership channel? That feels like, I mean, maybe 30 minutes isn't even enough when you look at NFL Live and NBA Today getting an hour, but they have the talent, they have the slot now, they have obviously expertise and a natural marketing vehicle to say, hey, now go watch the games this weekend. Like, why not that?
Yeah, I don't know. It's it makes sense to me. So I don't sorry, Drew, Drew just sent something to us to go back to our discussion about TGL real quick. Tiger Woods just ruptured his Achilles. So that sorry, I was a little
Is that
distracted.
your hot mic?
Yeah, as you were making your pitch, I was a little distracted because I'm like, do we fit this in now or do we circle back to it? Do we put a disclaimer on? But Tiger Woods apparently ruptured his Achilles, so that throws a wrench into the conversation we just had.
Well, good thing we didn't focus too much on Tiger Woods until the very end of that. But yes, best wishes to Tiger. I guess that does really change his involvement and my optimism that could allow his career to continue longer. That's crazy. I don't even understand how that could have happened. I guess maybe golfing not at TGL on a real course, I would have to think. I mean, I don't know. That just doesn't seem physically strenuous, but obviously we're over our skis a little bit in terms of trying to put our medical hats on. But
yeah,
my question on the hot mic thing is what's your understanding of, like, why has there not been college football programming in the past? Like, what do you think explains that? And I guess that would be the biggest thing in the way of it happening now is ESPN's just never done it, and it's been kind of obvious for a while that they should have, right? So maybe, like, I don't know.
ESPN's relationship with college football has always been, like, really strange to me because it seems to exist only Friday and Saturday. And obviously Saturday, like ESPN rules Saturday with college football. Yeah. College Game Day, like, is arguably the best thing that they do. If you were going to do a draft, it would definitely be a first round pick. And the games obviously speak for themselves, but they don't really talk about it on Mondays. Like, Monday is all about NFL fallout. They don't build up the games until Friday, it seems like, when they're on campus and have the shows there. It just, for whatever reason, ESPN has made a programming decision like that college football is this niche audience that only exists, like, around the games. And I know that's not the case. I've covered college football for a significant portion of my career. Like, there is a huge following there, and it's right up there. It's not the NFL, but it's maybe right behind the NFL in terms of popularity. So I don't know.
Do you think it's that they don't want to step on College Game Day, and there might be some sensitivity there of, like, that talent and that production staff has just built such a iconic thing that having there be a split? I mean, it's kind of like what's going to happen with NBA Countdown next year, where it's like no one's going to want to do that show, and then inside the NBA is going to be making fun of them, or you know what I mean? I don't think that Pat might do that on game day, frankly, but it might be that it's like it would kind of be looked at as the B team, and people's responsibilities would be split. So maybe you're not even getting Herb Street and people like that on the daytime show. I that's the best explanation I could come up with.
I think the explanation, if I'm guessing like what they see in their analytics in the way they map this all out, is that college football is local and that college football people are largely interested in their teams and they aren't necessarily interested in anyone else's team. And so that works on game day because like you have this whole slate of games to look forward to and it's right there. But like if you're going to have a daily college football show and they're talking about Ohio State and Georgia every day, that might only appeal to Ohio State, Georgia, and diehard college football fans. And I mean, I guess you could make the same case about their NFL coverage and the way they cover some of those teams and certainly their NBA coverage. But I do think there is something to college football that is like hyper local and they must see something that makes them think that it's not capable of carrying daily programming because they've had this opportunity to do it now for more than 3 decades.
Forever.
And they've never done it.
It's the Baseball Tonight problem basically, right? Where it's like, go watch Feinbaum if you care. We don't need to give it to you, or go, for all we care, go watch, Big Ten Network and leave our properties completely, whatever that might look like for you, or just turn on your AM radio dial in your city.
And they do have ESPNU still. They still have the SEC network. Like they have avenues to do that, but that's just how they've always treated it, is like kind of a la carte as opposed to like this is a feature. But yeah, I mean, your pitch makes sense to me.
So what do you have any guesses or hopes for what will replace that slot? Because I think the thing about the Around the Horn conversation is also it's probably going to, before too long, we're going to be talking about what replaces the whole 5 o'clock window, because PTI is not going to be around forever. Do you have any big takes on what happens there?
I think expanded Sports Center probably makes sense.
Just cut costs. Just rip it off. Yeah.
And that's maybe you do it a little more on site and maybe try to mirror what they've created with Scott Van Pelt and just make it kind of the pregame version of that, kind of like they do already for the NFL season, and just make it year round. I think you've kind of seen them experiment. They were just on Miami, Florida's campus for a Miami Duke basketball game for a daytime Sports Center. And so I think you are starting to see them toy with that a little bit, but I mean, that's kind of been the puzzling thing about this entire Around the Horn conversation. It's not like it's going away because they have something ready. Like it's going away here in 2 months, and there hasn't been like any inkling as to what they're going to put in that spot. It's really unique.
Absolutely. I do think that the 4 o'clock, or it's 4 o'clock my time, what is it? The 7 o'clock Sports Center has, no, the 6 o'clock.
6 o'clock. Yeah.
Has developed pretty well. It's Al Duncan and Kevin Nagandi. I think they do a really good job. Those are two recognizable, well-known talents who can do a variety of things. They can go on site. They can do interviews. They have takes. They're kind of interesting personalities and everything. So it wouldn't surprise me if those two just have earned a bigger spotlight if they were going to go that direction. All right, what's your hot mic?
My hot mic follows up on last week's hot mic, which was me giving up Twitter for non-religious reasons during Lent. And it's been hard. I'm not going to do a weekly check-in, but the first week was very hard. I woke up like thinking about things I wanted to tweet and then realized I couldn't post. But ironically,
have you heard of journaling?
I'm about to. I have all. Trust me. Like once I think it takes 3 weeks to build a habit, 21 days. Like once I'm out of my withdrawal, like I'm ready for world domination. Like we're going to be talking about $100 million contracts and me running for president here. So just got to get through these next 2 weeks.
Yeah.
But the most I wanted to tweet was when Twitter was down during the NFL trade deadline. And my super original, unique thought that I had to share with the world that I couldn't because one, I gave it up, and two, it was down, was how much I enjoyed Twitter being down for the first hour of NFL free agency, because it just took me back to a time where TV ruled the world when it came to transaction news. And it was Matt Clappen, an editor at Awful Announcing, and I were exchanging memories on Slack in our DMs about watching Baseball Tonight in 1998 and trying to figure out where Randy Johnson was going to get traded from the Seattle Mariners. And that's well, he wound up going to the Houston Astros, but then he made his way to your Diamondbacks.
We got there.
But,
we got there.
Yeah. The end game was all the same, but it was like that used to be how, like, even as recently as like 2009, I remember watching trade deadline specials for the NBA and trying to figure out if the Cavs were going to get Amari Stoudemire. Like, it's like, that's how people used to consume news and used to consume trade deadlines. And yeah, maybe like you were on the message boards and they might've found the links to the newspaper articles online early, but it wasn't this constant, stream of information. So it was really, I was surprised actually that ESPN was doing a free agency special on Monday, because it feels so antiquated and it feels so like 1998. And so the fact they were doing that at a time where Twitter happened to go down and we could consume it that way was like really, really cool to me.
Maybe they're the country that tanked Twitter. Maybe it was ESPN. Maybe it was Bristol, Connecticut was behind it, and they wanted people to tune in to the Sports Center special. That they don't usually do that, right? That was not I don't want to say the first time, but like I don't remember that last year.
Not for the legal tampering, not that I can recall.
Yeah.
And if they do, it's like background noise. Like it's nothing that anybody, but this, like, I'd love to see the ratings for that actually, because it felt like everybody was watching like Adam Schefter trying to actually break news without the aid of Twitter, which obviously we know aids all these insiders and teams and players and agents.
Well, that was the funny thing, is then you started to see all the subsequent reporting that like the team facilities are used to having Twitter up and keeping track of other teams' comings and goings that way. So it was just eye-opening to realize, for whatever reason, this is just, I mean, not for whatever reason, but for better or worse is what I mean. This has become like, Grand Central Station for news this time of year for the NFL or NBA when its time comes, or any number of other things. But I will say, I was on Twitter too and keeping track of that. I had the lovely handy dandy ESPN notifications to my phone, so anything Schefter put out was just going right there, and it took me back like 15 years, but I've been enjoying it actually.
It was actually awesome promotion for them. Like, that could not have worked out better for this.
Laura Rutledge was saying on air, like, sign up for the ESPN app notification. Like, you would never get that kind of plug. It would feel too like on the nose most of the time.
Yeah. I hope we get an off-season Hard Knocks, and I don't think we're gonna, because they haven't announced the team yet. But like, to see what that was like inside the facilities with Twitter going down, I would imagine you would get some great reaction from those teams.
I was just gonna say that I like the old fashioned better. I wish there was some kind of in between, because it is better when I get Dan Orlovsky's instantaneous take on something or whatever it might be. It's just the timing has always been the problem. They're not quick enough. But they were trying to thread that needle with having Schefter just basically glued to his phone and just spouting stuff as he went along. That's about as good as you're going to get, I think, to bring the kind of Twitter timeliness to an actual live thing that you're watching. So maybe the inventiveness might have forced them to get a little creative and actually maybe borrow from that in years to come. I don't know.
Yeah.
We've come a long way from Woj having to pretend like he doesn't know draft picks, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, that was certainly a time.
All right. Well, good luck with your continued Lent experiment there with
1 week strong
with Twitter. Maybe we'll do a check-in at the 3-week mark to see if the science was right and your habit has been successfully kicked. But until then, I'm Brandon Kleen. That's been Axelrod. Don't forget to check out awfulannouncing.com. We're covering this stuff minute to minute. We're also on social media, every single platform: X, TikTok, Instagram, Facebook, wherever you are. We are also there, and we'll be back with you next week.